So Sonic Frontiers is getting very close to its release, or if I'm too slow, has already been released. So in preparation for its launch, I figured that I'd take a look at the latest title in the series, but with a different approach. At the time of writing this video, the latest mainline title in the series is Sonic Forces, a game that had great ideas but failed to mixed reception. The previous game with a similar style was Sonic Generations, a celebratory anniversary title that focused on Sonic's history to create a well-received game. Both titles have many similar elements despite the 6-year gap between their releases, like the boost, classic Sonic, and the writing. After Sonic Lost World and Sonic Boom, Sonic Forces was a well-needed return to something familiar. But how did it fail with so much in common with Generations? Most people enjoyed Generations, and some people also enjoyed Forces too. But why did so many others not enjoy it as much? Well, I'm pretty sure most of you already know the answer, but I gotta make my 7-month hiatus seem more reasonable, so how about a comparison? We'll take a look at what both games did right and wrong, in story, visuals, and gameplay in that order, saving the best for last so we can quickly go over the smaller aspects first, and maybe with some extra stuff at the end. Obviously, to be fair to both, I'll keep my own bias out of it, but most of this is pretty subjective no matter how you look at it, so take this video with a grain of salt. So starting off, we'll look into the stories of both games, with Generations first. Right off the bat, there's not much here. Generations has a very straightforward plot of time travel, basically to give a reason why we're playing through old levels, so the story doesn't go any deeper than necessary. Cutscenes do the bare minimum, only here to slowly explain what's going on, and not much else. There's only 2 cutscenes that reflect on previous stages, but it's only those 2 cutscenes. There's not many references for longtime fans, which is a shame given how well that would fit in for a game like this, but that doesn't make the story terrible, just lackluster. It's simple and plays things safe, but as a result, there's a lot of missed potential and it leaves the story bare bones. Forces does the opposite though. Instead of a simple story, there's a bigger plot with something more serious and much more events going on. Unfortunately, the plot itself is handled very poorly and, similar to Generations, has missed potential. The premise of the story is that Dr. Eggman has finally taken over the world, with Sonic and Co. fighting against him to take it back. It's a good idea for the story, but they mess up the execution hard. There's too many issues with the story to really take it seriously, like various unexplained plot elements and mismatching tones from the characters. Here's a few specific issues. Classic Sonic holds no significance, Nullspace is heavily underutilized, Wisp's return with no explanation, the Phantom Ruby's origins are unexplained, and the start of the story where Sonic is presumed dead, only to be told that he's alive 5 minutes later. The ideas here are interesting, and like I said, it has potential, but things are horribly mismanaged, and it adds elements that don't need to be there or doesn't give enough attention to explain them. Despite the attempt at a serious plot, it's hard to take it seriously, especially when Sonic's still joking around, and they try to hammer in the friendship is power trope, which doesn't really mix well at all with the game's main story. Both of these stories are fairly inconsequential, and there's clear room for improvement. Generations doesn't really strive for anything special, and it's okay for what it is, but its lack of depth makes it unremarkable. Forces attempt something ambitious with a darker tone, more cutscenes, and more dialogue, but has far too many issues to make it work. There's missed potential from both ends, but we're talking about Sonic here. The story is far from the most important part of the game. Moving on to the visuals, I think it's safe to say that both games look amazing. Straight to the point though, Sonic Forces does have the advantage of better detail overall, with the standards for visual fidelity increasing between Generations and Forces. Generations doesn't look too bad though. For a game that's over a decade old, the game holds up pretty well. The aesthetics for each stage are well made, animations look smooth and stylish, it looks great all around. Some textures are fairly blurry and there is a bit of pop-in, but it's tolerable enough. In the middle of gameplay, you'll barely even notice any low quality textures given the game's high speed. It's mostly during cutscenes that you start to notice them, but then again, it's all really minor stuff. The entire game still looks great overall. Forces reaches the same qualities of Generations and improves on it. Along with the better graphics, cutscenes have more movement in them, and these QTE sections are well animated. Low resolution textures are basically gone, and pop-in has been heavily reduced, but you can still notice it if you look close enough. There are a few oddities though. For starters, 3-level aesthetics are reused: Green Hill, Chemical Plant, and the Death Egg. Generations had an excuse for basically being the first time these stage themes returned, and explained it through the story. This time, however, there's no real reason. At least how they're presented is a bit different, like Chemical Plant is frozen over, and we at least explore more of the Death Egg both inside and outside. Sonic is missing an idle animation, and he only has a single trick from homing attacks, but one thing that sticks out are the 2D sections, more specifically, the camera. That might sound odd, but hear me out. The camera really never changes its angle, and it makes all 2D sections seem really flat in presentation, especially in classic Sonic's levels where he's always centered within the camera. Here's a quick comparison. Notice how much the camera moves in Generations, while Forces keeps the same angle at all times. This is partially due to the level design's straightforward design, as it doesn't really allow the camera to move around as much, but I'll get into that later. Aside from that though, Sonic Forces does really well in its visuals, with great detail and animations throughout the game. Generations looks great especially for its age, but Forces looks better in most scenarios, adding on top of what Generations provided in visuals. Not to say that Generations is negligible, it still has some unique qualities, but Forces adds a lot to what Generations had, just with some minor details missing. Alright, now for the biggest part of the comparison, the main reason why Forces and Generations are so different. Gameplay is the most important part of both games, any game even. The story and visuals are also important, but gameplay matters a bit more. Because of how many factors there are in terms of gameplay, I'll split this into separate sections to make things a bit more organized. First, the game feel and overall control. In Generations, classic and modern Sonic have their differences in movement and weight, but things never feel clunky to control. They both have a logical sense of movement. Acceleration is smooth and gradual, jumps are responsive, and even at higher speeds, things are in your control. Modern Sonic may feel a bit weighty with slower movements, but with the boost, air dash, and stomp, platforming is manageable enough. Classic Sonic doesn't have momentum, but the game does try to replicate it in situations like this, where if I run down the slope, I do pick up speed, but if I roll, I don't. So it is a flawed system. However, the game is designed around it with levels focused more on platforming, so the lack of momentum isn't a massive hindrance to the core gameplay. His air movement is also pretty agile, and the spin dash is insanely powerful, keeping the pace going. Sonic Forces, on the other hand, is pretty stiff in movement. Both Sonics have lost their gradual sense of acceleration and weight, with more rigid physics and aerial movement. Classic Sonic never stops moving in the air, so you have to wiggle back and forth to stay centered. He still doesn't have momentum, but some levels aren't designed around it, placing big slopes and loops that show his lack of momentum if you simply run through them. In Generations, they replicate momentum if you run down slopes, but not when you roll. Here, it's the opposite, where if you run, you don't pick up speed, but if you roll, you do. It's odd how that works. The drop dash somewhat mitigates the problem, but it makes your jumps feel heavy because of how you perform it, and since level design is more focused on platforming, you won't really think about using it all too often. Modern Sonic has similar changes. Jumping feels stiff, acceleration goes from 10 to 100, and now he's lost some moves, specifically the drift, lightspeed dash, wall jump, and the air dash. The air dash specifically was replaced by the double jump, but it's so small it's nearly obsolete. The loss of the drift makes tight turns harder to approach unless you find a workaround or slow down, and at higher speeds in 3D, you're basically locked into the main path, barely allowing you to move left or right even just a little bit. Generations has a good sense of weight for both characters that controls smoothly in most situations, with nothing that feels off or unusual. Forces takes a lot of the control away with rigid movement and odd controls for both Sonics, with nothing to remedy the lack of movement. Now what about the levels? Let's talk about the length of them first. Lots of people talk about how short the levels are in Forces, and I'm pretty sure you've already heard about it. Most levels in Forces are notorious for their short length, going for about a minute to a minute and a half. For the very few levels that go on for a bit longer, they usually have QTEs that last about 20 seconds. The shortest level in Generations is about a minute and 20 seconds long, but that's the first level of the game, which is expected to be fairly short. After that, levels start to get longer, like around 2 minutes on average. Not to mention, to reach that time of a minute and 20 seconds, I have to speedrun the stage, and that goes for every level really. For example, let's take my playthrough of Sunset Heights with Modern Sonic. In a casual run-through, I mess around a bit and even go for a red ring in the middle of the stage. Once I finish, I get a time of 1 minute and 24 seconds. The closest time I can achieve to 1 minute and 24 seconds for a Modern Sonic stage in Generations is 1 minute and 35 seconds in Green Hill, and that's me trying to beat the stage as fast as possible. So to compare, I can easily beat Sunset Heights casually in 1 minute and 24 seconds, but I have to speedrun Green Hill as fast as I can to reach a time of 1 minute and 35 seconds. On average, Generations does have longer levels than Forces. That doesn't make Forces entirely worse though. The lengths of the stages do matter, but if the levels are designed to be short and sweet, then it can be excusable to some degree. And, well, let's see how that turns out. In level design, both games follow similar ideas for both Sonics. Classic levels focus on 2D platforming with some speedy parts here and there, while Modern Sonic is the opposite of that, focusing on keeping the speed going and less on platforming. But even though the idea is similar between the two games, how they're structured is very different. Let's look at the example I used before for Modern Sonic, Green Hill from Generations and Sunset Heights from Forces. In Generations, there are many branching paths throughout the level, and what path you go through mostly depends on your reaction time and skill. Most of the time, the faster path is usually harder to take, but it cuts down your time tremendously. Falling to a slower path has its own route and is much easier to access, but it's slower to get through. And most of the time, these fast and slow routes branch off into other slower and faster routes, which allows the stages to be more open and forgiving, but also more strict when maintaining speed on faster routes. Basically, there's a low skill floor and a high skill ceiling in level design. Forces leans towards linear level design. In Sunset Heights, branching paths are not present, even in 2D sections. The best way to describe the level design is you either take the normal path or a small shortcut. Alternate routes don't last for long, meeting up with the main route in just a few seconds. Not to mention, reaching the fastest route is not much harder than taking the main path, so you either take the main route, which is obviously slower and easier, or take the shortcut, which is faster and only a bit harder. And even outside of Sunset Heights, the few times there is a bigger separate path to take, it's poorly implemented into the level design and is just as easy to take. Because of this, the game is overall easier. There's a low skill floor, but also a low skill ceiling. The lack of difficulty isn't exactly a problem, but since most stages don't really stick out with any notable set pieces outside of the rare QTE, in addition to the short length of these stages, it leads most stages to be a bit forgettable. And those QTEs are fairly easy too, requiring a simple button press with a very generous time limit. Classic Sonic fares a bit better, but still has some issues. In Generations, he's got a lot of different paths with very open structures similar to modern Sonic, only now there's more focus on platforming and levels are entirely 2D. In Forces, that idea is the same and there are multiple paths here, but there are some odd design choices too. I already mentioned the big slopes and loops that highlight the lack of momentum, but there's also these invisible springs placed everywhere that most of the time have no reason being invisible. There's even these invisible springs that save you from a bottomless pit, which I guess makes sense for the first level, but what's the point of the bottomless pit then? There's also the fact that the level design never takes advantage of the background or foreground, so it's completely 2D instead of what Generations does with some 3D elements. And that's also why the camera looks so static compared to Generations. The level design doesn't really allow it to move around. And to add to the lesser level design, the object placement is also pretty bad. This wouldn't even be a point to compare, but it is so different between the two games, I just have to highlight it. Generations placed rings, enemies, springs, and all that other stuff really well. Rings are placed sparingly since they fill your boost gauge, and enemies are also placed sparingly for the same reason, or used for extra height. Boost pads are a way to push you in the right direction, or extra speed, but they aren't used too often, otherwise control would be taken away too many times. Objects are used as a way to flow well with the level design without being overbearing. As you can probably guess, Forces doesn't do this. It's not uncommon to be showered with rings since they don't fill the boost gauge, but there's not much value to them anyway since lives are no longer a thing. Enemies still have the same purpose, but they're used very often as an obstacle to boost through. Boost pads are also placed too often to keep pushing you forwards, even if it's absolutely unnecessary. It's not uncommon to see multiple lines of boost pads to keep you moving forward. And I already mentioned the invisible springs with Classic Sonic. All of these elements make Sonic Forces and its levels feel repetitive, with you doing the same thing for most of the game's runtime. Generations has a solid structure with multiple paths, good object placement, and a good length for most levels. Forces keeps linear levels aside from Classic Sonic stages, and linear levels aren't a bad thing, but with the overused object placement, easy difficulty, and terribly short levels that don't ask much of you to begin with, it leaves so much to be desired. And with that, we've covered the story, visuals, and gameplay of both games and looked at them side by side. But there's a few other things I haven't covered yet. There's also optional content from both games, since they both have side levels and optional collectibles in their main stages. So real quick, let me go over that, because it is very different in how these two games handle their side content. For optional collectibles, both games have red rings to collect, 5 in each main stage. In Generations, collecting one red ring unlocks concept art or music, and collecting all 5 in the stage gives you a skill. It's a simple system, giving decent rewards for exploring the level. In Forces, collecting enough red rings will slowly unlock extra stages, and collecting all 5 red rings in the stage will make 5 number rings show up in that stage. Collecting those number rings will make 5 silver moon rings show up in that stage. So after collecting the 5 silver moon rings, what does it get you? Well, nothing. In fact, collecting all number rings and silver moon rings in every stage gets you nothing as far as I know. And just to clarify, the next set of collectible rings won't show up until your next playthrough of that level, so you'd have to play through the same stage at least 3 times in order to collect everything in it. Only the red rings unlock something, but the number rings and silver moon rings don't get you anything. They're basically useless outside of needing them for 100% completion. So Forces takes what Generations had and adds a bit more, but instead of giving you more rewards, they give you nothing. I'll let you decide which system is better. Now what about the side stages? Forces only has 12 side stages, 6 that unlock throughout the story, and 6 that you unlock with red rings. All of these side stages are 2D and focus on a certain stage gimmick like disappearing blocks or lasers. It's all really blocky in level design and mostly focuses on platforming. It's okay for side stages, but it really seems lackluster in quality with all these boxes placed everywhere. However, Generations has 90 side stages that are both 2D and 3D, and not only focus on stage gimmicks, but other characters and skills like having 300% more boost, racing a character to the goal, or using an elemental shield. On top of having way more side stages and variety than Forces, the design of these side stages in Generations is generally better as well. Extra content in Forces feels like a last minute addition with how little there is and how most of the collectibles reward you with nothing. Generations has far more side content and much more polish to it, with collectibles that give decent rewards, a lot of side stages, and more variation within those side stages. In comparison, it looks like the side content in Sonic Forces was out of obligation rather than having fun extras. And with that, we've got our results. Both games have weak stories, Forces looks better overall, and Generations has better gameplay with better side content to boot. While Forces does excel in its visuals, Generations holds up much better in its gameplay, and for any game, the gameplay matters much more than anything else. Unfortunately, Sonic Forces failed in that department, and as a result, failed to compete against Generations. Even though Generations is over a decade old and has lesser graphics, it still plays better than Forces. But hey, all this is still somewhat subjective, so if you don't exactly value gameplay over visuals, maybe Forces was enjoyable to you, and vice versa if you enjoy Generations. But that should be everything I wanted to cover. Let me know if you found this video interesting, because it certainly was for me. This took a long time, not 7 months long, but still longer than it should have. So if you made it all the way here, thanks for staying until the end. Give the video a like if you enjoyed it, and all that other stuff. I don't have to tell you what to do.